Hello BookTube. I just finished reading Candide by Voltaire. This is actually a reread for me. I originally read it my sophomore year of college, which was almost 30 years ago now. So if you've been watching this channel, you'll know that I've been doing a number of rereads on this channel, and that's for a few reasons. But one reason, perhaps the biggest reason, is upon reaching middle age, I'm starting to realize that a lot of the classic books I read 30 years ago, I only partially remember. And perhaps those of you who are also middle-aged watching this might identify. You read these classic books when you're young, you think to yourself, okay, I have read that book, checked it off my list, I no longer need to revisit it, I can go on to read other books now. But then over time, your memory gets a little bit faded, and finally after maybe about 30 years, you think to yourself, I no longer remember this book clearly, it's time to revisit it. And so there are a number of books that fit that criteria for me, but Candide is certainly one of them. I remembered it in broad strokes. I remembered what the themes of the book were, but I could not have told you all the episodes that happened in the book after 30 years. So it was time to revisit this book. So anyways, like I said, I originally read this book when I was a sophomore in college. It was assigned reading as part of a world literature course I was taking. I was an English minor in college, and it made quite an impression on me at the time, and it helped that I was reading it for a course. So the professor explained it, we had class discussions about it, and it made the book seem a lot more exciting. And I had a really good professor. He was one of those professors who made everything seem interesting. So as he was explaining the themes of this book, he just made me really interested in the book. And also when you're 19, you're at a more impressionable age. That's kind of an age where you're just beginning to discover philosophy and literature and the major philosophical questions, and you're at an age when it all seems very new and exciting, and when it seems like it has a lot to offer, that there are major philosophical questions in life that can be explored and can be answered. Now that I'm middle-aged, I'm a little bit more cynical, and I feel like, well, okay, there are these mysteries in life, like why are we here, what is the purpose of life, etc. But now I'm not quite so sure that any one author can give any insight to these questions that hasn't already been given before. So that's my standpoint now. But when I was 19, reading this for the first time, it was a lot more exciting to me, the ideas in it. So let me give a brief introduction to this book then. This book was originally published in, when was it, 1759, and is considered one of the quintessential Enlightenment texts. So if you're talking about the Enlightenment, you have to talk about Voltaire, and you have to talk about Candide. As you can see, it's a thin volume. This book is, this edition is 87 pages long. Now, that is with with small type and thin margins. But still, it's not a large book. It's something that you could read in an afternoon or a couple of afternoons at most. And perhaps for that reason, it's frequently assigned in schools. So like I said, it was assigned reading for me in college. Just a couple weeks ago, I was actually substitute teaching at a high school. And this was assigned reading for the high school class I was substitute teaching at. And I was able to talk briefly to the teacher I was substituting for in the morning. And she said, they're reading Candide. And I said, oh wow, Candide. I said, I didn't read that until I was in college. And she said, yeah, well, I mean, it was an AP class. They were seniors, but still, I guess some people read this when they're still in high school. So, yeah, as always, I'm curious to know what your experience with Candide is. Did you read it in college, high school? When did you first hear about this? Was it assigned reading for you, etc.? So, yeah, there's a lot of little philosophical tidbits in this book, as I alluded to earlier. And like I said, if you have a really good professor or a good teacher who can explore some of these themes with you, you'll get much more out of this book, and it can be a really interesting book in that way. I am going to try to resist the temptation to explore that philosophy myself, because unfortunately, I am not that person. I am not somebody who's qualified to explore or talk about all the philosophy in this book, but there are plenty of other YouTube videos that you can find. Crash Course has an excellent video on this book. There's a lot of other videos. And so find somebody else maybe who will explore the philosophical themes of this book. I'm going to touch on it lightly, but I mainly just want to talk about this book in general and the reading experience, because that's what we do here on BookTube, right? We just talk about what the reading experience of this book was like. And I'm not going to try and give the definitive review of Candide. So the book moves at a lightning pace. Tons of stuff happens. The characters go all over the globe, and they just zoom from place to place. And it's not a book that wastes any time in long descriptions. It's just, okay, the character goes here, he meets another character, they fight, he kills him, then he goes over there, he meets another character, they fall in love, then he goes over here. It's just, it's everything's happening extremely fast, and there is very little language lost in describing any details. It's funny, I mentioned I was substituting for a class who was reading this recently, and some of the kids were looking up the Cliff Notes for it on the computer. And of course, high school students, they always want the easy way out, going to the Cliff Notes. But, as I was rereading this myself the past couple days, the thought occurred to me, why would you go to the Cliff Notes for this? I mean, this book is like the Cliff Notes of a larger novel. Like, there's no fat in here at all. Everything is just one thing rapidly happening after another. So, and the chapters are so short. I mean, this is a chapter. So imagine going to the Cliff Notes for this so you don't have to read the chapter. You just might as well read the chapter, huh? Oh, okay. That little rant is over. Moving on. Now, the book is loaded with references to stuff that was happening in the world at the time it was written. And this is where having a good teacher or a good professor will help, or having a lot of footnotes. This edition had some footnotes in it, but there was still plenty of stuff that wasn't explained. You can, of course, look it up online, although it alters the reading experience if you're constantly putting this book down to go to Wikipedia to find out what it's referencing, or you can find the Cliff Notes online, which will explain some of these allusions to you, etc. Or you can just read it and be content not to catch every single reference and allusion that's in here. The book is kind of like Don Quixote in that regard, or perhaps like a number of classic books, in that there are different levels. If you want to analyze this in detail and try and look up every reference, you can. And if you want to just read it on a surface level and enjoy it as a zany story where a bunch of weird stuff happens and not worry about catching all the references, You can. And, my personal philosophy with this kind of book is read it once at a surface level. I have a type of personality. I tend to get a little bit obsessive about stuff. So this is a little bit difficult for me to do. I kind of think to myself, no, if I'm going to read it, I'm going to catch every reference, and I'm going to go to Wikipedia, and I'm going to look up the Cliff Notes to try and find all the different allusions here. And at a certain point, you just have to say, look, I'm just going to read it from the front to the back. I'll read what notes are in my edition, but I'm not going to bother about tracking down every reference in this book. And you can always come back to it and do a more in-depth study later. But for the first time through, or in my case, for the first time through in 30 years, just enjoy it as a surface story. So it's a dark comedy. All these grotesque things are happening, but they're so bizarre that you can't you're not emotionally involved in any of it, and it's all just happening at such a fast pace that you're just kind of amused by this grotesque tragicomedy that is happening. I said I wasn't going to get too deep into the philosophy, but you can't help but talk about the philosophy a little bit. And the overarching theme of this book is it's a rebuttal to the philosophy of optimism. So apparently there was a philosophy of optimism associated with some German thinker whose name I don't remember, which is that because God is good, the world he has created is the best world that could be. So we are living in the best of all possible worlds. And this was apparently a philosophy that was in vogue at the time. And it's not in vogue anymore. And perhaps one reason that it's not in vogue is because Voltaire so thoroughly skewered that idea that by the time you're done reading Candide, it's impossible to take that idea seriously anymore. Although I think sometimes you do hear variants of this philosophy expressed in somewhat different words. So I grew up religious, in a religious community. I still have ties to that community. People I knew from church or the Christian schools I went to, who I keep in touch with, who will quite often express sentiments like everything happens for a reason, God has a plan, everything works out according to God's plan. I think that could be classified as a variant of the optimist philosophy. And that idea as well is very thoroughly skewered in Candide. Although ironically enough, I did read this at a Christian college that I went to many years ago. So there you go, huh? But not just Christians. I remember in Vietnam, I was at one point talking to a Vietnamese friend who was explaining to me a popular best-selling book, and I don't remember the name of the book, unfortunately. It was originally written in English but translated into Vietnamese. And she was explaining to me that this book was explaining the philosophy that ultimately the universe is good and good things will happen to people. That was the gist of the book, apparently. And she was saying to me, just read the book. It all makes sense to you. And I said, okay, but I'm going to recommend that you read Candide. This was a few years ago, but the book was still on my mind, and I still remembered the general themes of it. So, yeah. Anyways, point being, it might still be somewhat relevant today, depending on who you talk to. But yeah, by the time you're done reading Candide, the idea that we are living in the best of all possible worlds has been thoroughly skewered. perhaps a little bit too thoroughly, because you kind of get the point fairly early on. I mean, within like the first 5 pages, you're like, okay, this is not the best of all possible worlds. A lot of terrible things happens all the time, randomly to people with no reason, and there's a lot of pain and suffering in the world. And you get that very early on. And then the book just keeps on going and keeps on going, and you're like, all right, I get it. Lots of terrible stuff happens, and then the book just keeps on going. And there are other philosophical tidbits thrown in there as well. But yeah, the book maybe overemphasizes its main point. There are plenty of examples in here, but I guess the biggest example is an earthquake in Lisbon, in Portugal, which it was a historical event. I guess there was this big earthquake in Lisbon followed by a tsunami wave that killed, I don't remember, thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. And it happened a few years before this book was published, but Voltaire was greatly influenced by that event when he wrote this book. And Voltaire obviously regarded that huge earthquake in Lisbon as proof that we are not living in the best of all possible worlds, where there is a benevolent God who is actively involved in human affairs and making everything perfect. So, yeah, and I mean, I mentioned before you don't need to catch every reference in this book to enjoy it on a surface level. But I think that one reference you should be aware of, that there was actually a big earthquake in Lisbon, which is what the earthquake in Lisbon section in Candide is based on. Yeah, it's funny. That big earthquake in Lisbon was a huge deal at the time. But I don't think nowadays anyone would remember it or anybody would talk about it if it wasn't a plot point in Candide. So it's an example of how literature preserves the memory of these events, which would otherwise be completely forgotten about because of all the other things that happen in human history. So there you go. Now, yeah, the overarching theme of this book is that a lot of terrible and tragic stuff happens in human history and in human affairs. And like I said before, this is played both as a serious philosophical point, but also played for zaniness. Like just one bad thing after another happens to these characters until it just gets ridiculous. And characters will tell their tale of woe, and it just starts out tragic, but then it just gets more and more ridiculous until it's being almost played for humor. A very dark and twisted sense of humor. Apparently, this is something I learned from John Green's Crash Course video. When this book was first published, a lot of people wanted it banned because of the kind of grotesque humor in the book, which I guess is not surprising. You know, you read this and you're kind of like, oh, all right, we're making a joke about this now? Yeah, okay, I guess we're making a joke about this now. You know, I guess that's you have to kind of go along with that if you're going to read this book. So some subjects which would normally be off limits for humor are yeah, not off limits in this book. Yeah, the ending of the book, I guess spoilers. I mean, if Voltaire does not believe in the philosophy of optimism, that we are living in the best of all possible worlds, then I guess that raises the question, well, what are we doing here? What is the meaning of life, etc.? Voltaire, I guess, was a deist, meaning he believed in a creator God, but one that was not actively involved in human affairs. I don't know if that's terribly obvious from reading this book that he believed in a creator God, but according to Wikipedia, etc., that's what he believed in. So, but yeah, what are we doing here on life, huh? Well, at the end of the book, Candide and his friends just learn to cultivate their garden. So they're in this house with a garden, and they find meaning in life by their daily work, which involves cultivating the garden and also some other simple tasks like sewing and mending clothes and stuff like that. And it's this work which brings meaning to their lives. I'm sort of reminded of a lecture I saw on YouTube by Jordan Peterson, who is somebody I have mixed feelings about, but we'll save that subject for another day. Some of the stuff that Jordan Peterson says, at least, I think are interesting. And in this particular video, he was talking about the fatality of pursuing happiness. And he said, if you think that happiness is the purpose of living, then you're going to be in for a lot of frustration, because there's a lot of trouble in life. And, he says there are a lot of people in hard situations, either because of physical illnesses or because they have to care for somebody who is physically ill, that people who give birth to a disabled child and then you spend a lot of time caring for them, etc. And he says, if your idea of if your purpose in life is to be happy, then well, that's game over for you. But he said, your purpose in life is to be useful to other people. And by being useful, then you can achieve a sense of satisfaction or fulfillment, which I guess is a kind of happiness. I'm paraphrasing and I'm extrapolating a little bit from what he said, but that was the general gist of it. So I think that would be in line with what's going on here in Candide. Now, as you're reading this book, I think you can't help but feel that this is a little bit of a pat answer to a complex problem. So you're reading this book and you're like, oh, all right, Voltaire, I hear you. Life sucks. There's a lot of terrible things going on. Human condition is misery, etc. But then you get to the ending where he's trying to just kind of wrap it up a little bit neatly before he closes the book, and you're like, no, that's too simplistic an answer. And maybe that's what I mean a little bit when I was talking earlier and I said, when I was younger, this stuff had more of an influence on me, because when I was younger I thought, so that's the secret. And you kind of think that these thinkers or these big philosophers have some sort of secret wisdom to impart. As you get a little bit older, you're like, okay, that's all right for what it is, but that's only going to go so far. John Green as well, on his crash course video, which you should totally check out. Crash course video on Candide, also criticizes the ending here. So I'm a little bit influenced by John Green's video, but I was also thinking that myself as I got to the end of this book. I read this book before I went and watched the crash course video. Excuse me, my voice was getting a little bit foggy there. So, yeah, I think that's basically all I have to say about this book there's a lot more to talk about in this book. I've talked about maybe the obvious theme of the book, but it's one of those books where there are a lot of little philosophical tidbits scattered all throughout. And for that, you're going to need somebody else to guide you through it. So hopefully you have a really good teacher or a really good professor who can explain this book to you as I once had 30 years ago. Otherwise, search on YouTube. There's plenty of explainer videos for Candide. And I will close out here. What? Okay, just to round things off. It's a recommend. It's interesting to read. It's a quick read. It's weird, but it's never boring. It's something that perfectly caters to the modern short attention span, which is perhaps another reason why it's often assigned in high schools. So if you haven't read it yet, it's a recommend. Don't worry about understanding everything your first read. Just enjoy it on the surface level. You can always come back to it later. And if you're like me and you read it once long ago, I recommend you come back to it, because why not? You've probably forgotten half of it. It's a really quick read. It's interesting. Don't worry about catching all the references. Just come back to it and read it on the surface level to refresh your memory a bit. Thank you, BookTube.